Our lesson this morning is going to be a response to a question that comes out of our question and answer box. If you're not familiar with that, there is a physical box in the back on the table. There used to be slips of paper out there. I probably should print some more, but feel free to write it on a napkin or on any piece of note paper that you have. If you have a question you'd like to be answered from this format, feel free to submit it that way. You can also do it digitally on this cool QR code if you like those kinds of things. But from time to time, I go back there and try to answer questions that are on your minds, things that you have in your mind and are thinking about. And so I thought, why not pick an easy question to answer at the start of the new year? And so this is the one we're going to go with. An ancient philosopher once said that if God is all good, then he is not all powerful. And if he is all powerful, then he is not all good. The question is, how do Christians reconcile this philosophy in believing in a God that is both all good and all powerful? And I believe the implication there is, if we live in a world where evil exists, how can we say that we believe in a God that is all powerful and all good? I jest a little bit because this is a really, really challenging question. This has stumped more than a few philosophers and scholars and theologians over the last couple thousand years. But this question is referring to a statement supposedly made by the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus. It's generally quoted as follows. This is, if you go look up Epicurus's quote about this problem, about this question, this is the way it'll come across. Epicurus is often quoted as saying, "Would God be willing to prevent evil but unable? Therefore he is omnipotent. He is not omnipotent, Would he be capable but without desire? So he is malevolent. Would he be both capable and willing? So why is there evil?" That's the way that Epicurus is often quoted as presenting this problem. As maybe a side note, just if you're interested in ancient philosophy, this quote probably did not come from Epicurus. We have no document from Epicurus with this quotation preserved. Even so, this idea, this quote, or this conundrum has come to be called the Epicurean paradox, or more simply, the problem of evil. The argument can be articulated kind of simply like this. If we grant, I don't know, can y'all read that? That's pretty small. Okay. If we grant that an all-powerful and all-loving and all-knowing God, we would assume that God would stop evil wherever it exists. That would be the first premise of this line of reasoning. The second premise would be something like this. Evil exists in the world. And given those two premises, if evil exists in the world and an all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing God would stop evil, then the problem of evil would conclude that maybe God does not exist. And so many philosophers over several centuries have denied God's existence because they see evil around them. Because evil exists in the world. Now, this is a really important objection to God's existence for us to wrestle with and for us to answer. The reality of the existence of evil has caused countless people to turn against God, to reject God as being real or being something that is all-powerful and all-loving and all-knowing. And part of the reason why this has deeply troubled so many people is because this problem, the existence of evil in our world, is a deeply emotional problem and a deeply personal problem. If you just go, do simple searches on the internet, on social media, you don't have to look hard before you find people who have turned against God saying things like, "Why did God allow this? Why would God let this horror, this suffering, this evil happen to me or to my family or to my loved one or even to those people over there that I don't know? If God is real," they reason, "surely God wouldn't allow those kinds of things. Why didn't God intervene for me? Why didn't God interject himself into my life or my loved one's life in this or that circumstance? When they were ill, when that accident occurred, when this a horrible thing happened. It's an emotional problem and it's a personal problem. And because of that, it is very persuasive to people, especially when they're in the midst of that kind of trauma. But it's also a universal problem. Everyone, everywhere, has struggled with evil and suffering. Maybe some have struggled more. Maybe some have seen greater evils than others. Maybe some haven't seen many evils or large evils, but everyone has come face to face with some kind of evil. Everyone has come face to face with some kind of suffering. And so it's important that we come up with some kind of a response to this. Not just for the people around us so that we can give them answers, but for ourselves. Because if you haven't confronted evil in any kind of major way in your life, you will. If you have not suffered greatly, you will, in some form or fashion. And the question is, when we encounter evil, will it cause us to turn against God? Because it has caused so many other people to turn against him. And so it's important to consider carefully whether the existence of evil should cause us to doubt the God of the Bible. What I want to do to answer this question is I want to share with you 3 responses to the problem of evil that I find personally helpful, that I find personally convicting. Some of them are more logical than others. Some of them may be more emotional than others. But I want to share 3 responses that I find helpful in answering this kind of argument or this kind of line of reasoning. The first response I would share is this. The problem of evil assumes that we can know, identify, and agree upon what objective evil really is. Now, this is kind of an abstract argument, perhaps. And it's probably more logical than emotional. But the problem of evil, this argument that suggests that because this evil thing happened, God must not exist, assumes that you and I can actually agree on what is truly, objectively evil. This deserves to be challenged, though. How can we possibly know what evil is unless there is an objective moral standard by which good and evil are measured? We might look at any number of tragedies where individuals suffered, or we might look at any number of tragedies where large groups suffered. We might turn our news stations on and see news of mass shootings or bombings or terror attacks, or we might see the local news about a local break-in or a theft or car accidents on the highway. Any number of things that you and I would look at and say, well, that's evil. That's suffering. That is objectively bad. We might look at those things and rightly acknowledge that those are evil. But my question is this: on what basis can we look at any of those things and say they are evil? Why do you call them evil and not good? Why is a mass shooting wrong? Why is a car accident terrible? Why don't we look at those things and say, well, all right, that's just a thing that happened? Why are we filled with such a visceral reaction to certain kinds of things that we see around us in the world? If someone says, God would certainly have stopped that shooter, God certainly should have stopped that shooter, God should have diverted that hurricane. If God existed, he wouldn't have let that hurricane, roll over that country. If somebody says those kinds of things, they are assuming that the actions of the shooter or the results of the hurricane are objectively evil. And they're right to do that. But on what basis? The only way that something can be objectively good or evil is if there is an objective standard for us to measure these things against. The only way you know what a foot is, or a yard is, or a mile is because there is an objective marker, a measuring tool that shows you objectively this is that. The same is true when it comes to moral conundrums. The only way that we can know what is objectively good or evil is if we have an objective standard to measure these things against. if there is no moral lawgiver that is greater than us, that is beyond us, that is beyond our world, if there's no moral lawgiver, then these are just random events that have no morally good or evil qualities. If you accept the premise that evil exists in the world, then you have to explain what the objective standard for good and evil is. The problem of evil doesn't disprove God's existence. The problem of evil requires God's existence as the absolute standard of good and evil so that we can even label evil to begin with. It's my first response. Maybe you find that helpful, maybe you don't. But my second response would be this. The problem of evil assumes that it is always better to stop suffering in every instance. Is that true? How do we know that God does not have good reasons to allow some suffering? After all, shouldn't we assume that an all-powerful and all-knowing God might have knowledge beyond our own? You know, this is actually exactly the lesson that God taught Job. Of course, Job's story is directly related to the problem of evil. You and I look at Job's story and we would correctly identify things that happened to him as suffering. We would look at his life and say, that is evil, that is terrible, that is horrifying. To look at the way that he lost his children in an untimely manner, the personal loss of his own health, even his own wealth, the things he had accumulated and worked for throughout his life, being surrounded by people who criticized him at every turn for the things that he did or didn't do allegedly. But at the end of the day, when we get to Job chapter 41, and God and Job finally come face to face, and God speaks to Job, do you know what God says? Who are you to ask me why these things happen? Who are you to know what is in my mind and to know why or why not I might allow bad things to happen? At the end of the day, Job was no match for God's power or knowledge. Job hadn't created the heavens and the earth. He hadn't carved out the course of the land. He hadn't stopped the waters on the shore where they belong. He didn't fashion the animals. He didn't control the beasts. God is the one who was in control. And as a result, God is very blunt with Job. He says, you don't have enough information to determine whether this should or should not have happened. Is it possible that there are times where God, knowing all things, might have good reasons to allow suffering in our lives? I want to go to the New Testament with you, and I want to read Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12. The Hebrews writer speaks, I think, to some of this. Hebrews chapter 12, I'm going to start in verse 4. The people that are being written to in the book of Hebrews are suffering at this time for their faith. They're suffering, and yet in verse 4, the Hebrews writer says, you are suffering, but you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood. He says, you're not martyrs yet. You haven't been killed. Your bodies haven't been harmed yet. You are suffering greatly. He's not discounting that. But there's more suffering that can and probably will happen. So he says in verse 4, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood in your striving against sin, and you have forgotten the exhortation which is addressed to you as sons. My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor faint when you are reproved by him. For those whom the Lord loves, he disciplines, and he scourges every son whom he receives. It is for discipline that you endure. God deals with you as with sons, for what son is there whom his father does not discipline? But if you are without discipline, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Furthermore, we had earthly fathers to discipline us, and we respected them. Shall we not much rather be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time, as seemed best to them, but he disciplines us for our good, so that we may share his holiness. All discipline for the moment seems not to be joyful, but sorrowful. To those who have been trained by it, afterwards it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. What the Hebrew writer tells us is that there are times in our lives where God disciplines us. He might even allow for our suffering or for the shedding of our blood, but there is a reason for it. There are times that the suffering that we endure, the discipline that we endure, is for our good. The Hebrews writer specifically says that it might instill in us holiness and righteousness. Now, I need to make clear this point. I'm not suggesting that every time evil comes upon us that it is from God. I don't believe that. But what I am suggesting is that we may never be in a position to know why we suffer. It may be that God knows more than us. I think also about 2 Corinthians chapter 12, when Paul was talking about the thorn in his flesh that was given by God through Satan, a messenger of Satan, but God allowed it to persist. He prayed asking God to remove it, but God refused to remove the thorn. And you say, well, why? Why would God do that? This is clearly something that is not pleasant for Paul. Maybe it's even something that's causing him harm or suffering of some kind. People suppose of different things that it might be. But God's very clear, Paul's very clear. God wouldn't remove it so that Paul would remain humble. There was a reason for the suffering. Parents in the audience know this all too well. I love my children, and there are times that I have power to stop bad things from happening to them, but there are also times when I allow those bad things to happen to them so that they can learn from those things. Like when they're walking in front of their brother who is swinging. Sometimes I don't stop that from happening because I want them to know that you probably shouldn't do that. We understand this. There may be lessons from evil that God knows we need to learn. There may be strength or courage that we need to gain. There may be righteousness, holiness, humility that God is teaching us through the things we endure in life. Let me offer a third response here to the problem of evil. The problem of evil seems to cast God as an ambivalent being who stands by passively watching our pain without power or desire to intervene. It's like, well, if God could step in, surely he would, so maybe he can't. Or maybe he just doesn't care about us. The problem of evil suggests that God is just standing by watching our pain as if he doesn't really love us. That's simply not true concerning the God of the Bible. The fact is, when we start reading the stories of the Bible, it becomes pretty clear pretty quickly that God detests evil, and he steps in to stop evil very, very frequently. There are countless stories in the Old Testament where God doesn't merely allow evil things to happen, but he gets down into the world and confronts evil head on and holds the guilty parties accountable. For example, in Genesis chapter 6, there's this story where God floods the whole earth and destroys every living thing except for 8 souls on the ark. You know why he did that? Genesis 6 tells us why. It says he did it because the thoughts and intentions of the minds of men were only on evil continually. Don't tell me that God never comes in and stops evil. That's literally the God of the Bible. He stops evil all the time. God had the Canaanites wiped out by the Israelites because their evil had become so pervasive. Genesis 15 verse 16 says he was even patient with them. He says, I'm going to give them a chance. I'm going to let them live and hopefully they'll repent and return. But one day, Abraham, when their evil and wickedness is filled up and overflowing, you're going to go be my instrument of punishment. I'm going to confront that evil. God used the Assyrians to judge the evil in Israel. He used the Babylonians to judge the evil of the Assyrians. He used the Persians to judge the evil of the Babylonians. God isn't merely letting things happen. He's not just letting evil happen. He is the judge who steps in and deals with it. And the Bible is clear that God will confront evil in the future. Those who are opposed to God and religion often ridicule the idea that God would send people to hell, that there would be a place of eternal punishment. People ridicule that and say, well, what an evil God that is. But here's the truth. God's promise to send people to hell is a clear acknowledgement that God sees evil and intends to do something about it. God isn't interested in letting evil continue forever. God isn't interested in letting evil go unchecked or unpunished or unchallenged. Atheists often call God a monster when he deals with the problem of evil. How could God destroy the whole earth? How could God wipe out the Canaanites? How could God send people to hell? But the reality is, this is God dealing with the problem of evil. The problem of evil is real. It is a troublesome challenge to the existence of God, and it has caused many people to doubt their faith. But the identification of evil requires the existence of a moral standard. It requires God, the ultimate absolute standard of good. We can't know what evil is if we don't have something to measure it up against. God may have good reasons to allow suffering in certain circumstances. And God has, and he will do something about evil in the world. I'm under no delusion that I can solve this problem with a few simple answers or responses. The problem of evil has been a thorn in the flesh of thinkers and Bible students and Christians and atheists alike for centuries, for thousands of years even. And so I don't suggest that these are like the final be-all answers, but these are answers that are helpful to me as I think through these problems. What I hope you can see, though, is that the problem of evil doesn't have to destroy your faith. There are solid, logical, and comforting explanations that can help us think through this dilemma. None of this makes evil or suffering more palatable. I don't want you to walk out of here and just happy you get to face evil today. That's not the point. It doesn't make it easy or enjoyable to suffer or to face evil in the world, but perhaps these responses can help us think through the problem with faith and with hope in our God. I'll just make one more observation about God and his relationship to evil here as we wind this down and close this out. And that is that God doesn't just watch us suffer. I find great comfort in this. God doesn't just watch us suffer, but God came to suffer with us and for us. And that's the story of the gospel. In fact, the gospel story is the Bible's best answer to the problem of suffering. Because in the gospel story, God became flesh and dwelt among us. He entered our world full of all of the evil and sin and full of all of the suffering and pain. He entered our world and suffered with us. And he suffered for us so that we might not suffer eternally. The gospel is God's solution to suffering. And if you'd like to know more about that, we want to sit down and have a conversation with you. We want to study with you. We want to help you know what the Bible teaches about suffering and about its solution to suffering. If you know the gospel message, if you know that Jesus died for your sins, was raised from the dead, defeating death and suffering, and you need to respond to that, we're ready to pause everything right now and help you become a Christian, help you enter into a relationship with God. If there's anything we can do for you, you're welcome to come and let us know as we stand and as we sing this song together.